Welcome back. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a like. Enjoy the video. Desmond Harris, a black man, walked casually along Treeline Street, his hoodie draped over his broad shoulders, hands in his pockets. To him, it was just a quiet stroll, but for some, his presence would be anything but ordinary. The sun was setting on a perfect autumn evening, casting a warm glow on the quiet upscale neighborhood. The wide streets lined with trees turning brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold spoke of wealth and comfort. It was the kind of place where things never seemed out of place until today. Desmond Harris walked casually along Treeline Street, his hoodie draped over his broad shoulders, hands in his pockets. To him, it was just a quiet stroll, a chance to breathe in the cool evening air. But for some, his presence would be anything but ordinary. From one of the larger homes across the street, a curtain twitched, and a pale face appeared in the window, watching with concern. Peace in this neighborhood wasn't as easily found for everyone. Inside the house, Margaret Evans stood silently behind the sheer curtains of her bay window, phone in hand. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she watched Desmond walk. She didn't recognize him, and she prided herself on knowing everyone in this neighborhood. Her heart raced with suspicion. Maybe she'd seen him before, maybe not, but something felt off to her. It wasn't a place for strangers. Margaret, a woman in her mid-40s, had always been proud of the fact that she maintained an active presence in the community. She was the one people turned to for organizing events and keeping track of the comings and goings in the neighborhood. Her light blonde hair bounced slightly as she moved from window to window, following the figure's slow walk. Her husband Peter was out of town, and their teenage daughter was upstairs doing homework. Margaret was alone with her thoughts. He had been walking for what felt like a little too long now. Why was he here? The world was filled with enough unsettling news. She didn't want her neighborhood to be next. She turned from the window, biting her lip, then glanced back again. He seemed to have slowed down as though he was looking at the houses, maybe checking if someone was home. The phone in her hand felt heavier instead. She had heard stories friends had shared in hushed tones at dinner parties and in online neighborhood groups. It was always the same: an unfamiliar figure, a burglary, or worse soon after. She wouldn't let that happen here. Not in this neighborhood. Desmond was unaware of the watchful eyes, and he just kept walking. He was not in a rush, simply appreciating the change of seasons, the beauty of the place he had recently begun calling home. It had taken years of hard work to get here, to live in a place like this, to have this moment. People often said these neighborhoods were symbols of having made it. But that feeling was still elusive, even with a good job, a nice house, and the accomplishments he had achieved. The gaze of others weighed heavy. Desmond's mind wandered back to the times when his presence had been questioned, the way strangers would subtly or blatantly ask for proof of belonging, whether through a glance, a question, or a call to the authorities. Margaret's phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. It was a message from the neighborhood group chat. Another woman asking if anyone else had seen the man walking around. Her suspicions were confirmed. It wasn't just her who noticed. Others were concerned too. Without thinking too much longer, she dialed 911. "Yes, there's a man walking through the neighborhood," she said, her voice low but firm. "He looks out of place. I think he's hiding something in his hoodie. He's casing the place, and I think it's worth checking out." The call was quick and professional. The operator assured her that a patrol car would swing by to have a look. She felt a strange sense of relief, though a pang of doubt tugged at the edge of her mind. Was she doing the right thing? Was she overreacting? She didn't care anymore. This was her neighborhood, her family's home, and she couldn't afford to take chances. Meanwhile, Desmond had stopped briefly at a corner, admiring a particularly large oak tree. It reminded him of his childhood. The trees his grandfather used to tell stories under. Lost in thought, he didn't hear the approaching patrol car right away. The faint sound of sirens pulled him out of his reverie. But it wasn't until the patrol car turned the corner that his entire aura shifted. The vehicle slowed as it approached, its lights flashing but siren off. 2 officers, one male and one female, stepped out cautiously, their eyes scanning him. "Sir, we'd like to speak with you for a moment," the male officer said, hand resting lightly on his belt. It was a scene all too familiar. Calmly, he raised his hand slightly to show he meant no harm, keeping his voice steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Proceed." The female officer, who had stayed a step behind, glanced at her partner before speaking. "We received a call about someone matching your description, walking and looking suspicious around the area. Just doing a routine check. Do you live here?" The question was inevitable, but each time it stung. It wasn't about the words, but about what they carried. The assumption of not belonging, the thinly veiled suspicions. In these moments, it didn't matter how many degrees he had or how long he had worked to afford a place in this neighborhood. In their eyes, he was just a black man out of place. "Yes, I do live here," Desmond answered calmly, his voice firm but polite. He could see the officers relax slightly, though the male officer continued to study him. "What's your address?" the officer asked. Desmond gave him the address, which was just a few blocks away. There was a brief pause. The officers exchanged glances before the male officer spoke again. "Mind if we see some ID?" Without hesitation, he reached into his pocket, slowly pulling out his wallet and handing over his driver's license. The officers inspected it, and after a few moments, the tension began to dissolve. The female officer handed back the ID with a tight smile. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir. Sorry for the inconvenience. We'll be on our way now." Desmond nodded, watching as they returned to their car, the unspoken words between them loud in the air. The patrol car was slowly pulling off, but he stood there for a moment longer, letting the weight of the encounter settle in. The evening had lost some of its warmth, the peace of the walk. The enjoyment of the neighborhood now carried a bit of bitterness that lingered. But before Desmond could take more than a few steps, the sound of a door flying open caught his attention. The sharp crack of it echoed down the quiet street. Margaret Evans stormed out of her house, her face flushed and her eyes wide with certainty. "He doesn't live here!" Her voice cut through the evening air louder than a siren. "That man doesn't live here. I've never seen him in my life, and I know everyone in this neighborhood." Desmond stopped mid-step, turning slowly to face the scene unfolding behind him. The officers who had just begun to leave paused in their patrol car. The male officer exchanged a quick glance with his partner before they both stepped out again, visibly tense, their hands drifting toward their belts. Margaret was already halfway across her lawn, her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she marched toward the officers, her face filled with frustration, as if this was a personal affront to her authority in the neighborhood. "I don't know who he showed you an ID for," she continued, her voice rising, "but I'm telling you he doesn't belong here. I've lived here for 15 years. I know who my neighbors are, and his type of people are not one of them." The man stood still, his chest tight, watching the entire scene unfold with a sense of disbelief. Just moments ago, the situation had seemed resolved, but now this woman, this stranger, had escalated it to a level he had not anticipated. The male officer, standing slightly taller than his partner, furrowed his brow and glanced back at Desmond. There was a noticeable shift in his stance, an inclination toward believing Margaret simply because she was speaking with such confidence. Her anger, her certainty seemed to stir something in him, as if her proximity to the neighborhood automatically gave her the upper hand in this exchange. "Ma'am," the officer began, trying to keep his voice level, "we've already spoken with the gentleman. He gave us his address and identification." Margaret cut him off with a wave of her hand, eyes darting back toward Desmond. "I don't care what ID he showed you. It must be fake. For all you know, he could have gotten it online. People do that kind of thing all the time. This isn't just some misunderstanding. I'm telling you, he's not from around here. This is my neighborhood, and I'm not going to let someone who doesn't belong here just walk around unchecked." The female officer, standing next to her partner, seemed more hesitant, her eyes going between Margaret and Desmond, her hand now resting lightly on the top of her taser holster. Desmond could see the doubt creeping into her expression. It was as if the weight of Margaret's whiteness, her homeowner status, her apparent deep knowledge of the neighborhood, tipped the scales in a way that no identification or calm explanation could. "Sir," the male officer said, his voice now more forceful, "can you show us that ID again?" There it was again, the unspoken accusation hanging thick in the air like smoke. Desmond felt the familiar frustration rise in his chest. He had done everything right. He had followed their instructions, provided his address, and showed his ID. But still, here they were, ready to second-guess him, because a white woman had declared he didn't belong. Slowly, he pulled his wallet from his pocket again, his movements careful and deliberate. He extended the ID toward the officer, his heart pounding with the weight of the moment. The officer took it, glancing down at the card, and this time Margaret peered over his shoulder, trying to catch a glimpse of the address. "That's impossible," she said. "I've never seen him here. I'm telling you, he must have snuck in somehow. Maybe staying at a friend's house, but I know this man doesn't live here. Just look at him. He doesn't even look like he can afford it." The male officer's brow furrowed deeper. His partner shifted uneasily beside him, glancing at Margaret as if seeking confirmation. "Are you sure, ma'am?" the female officer asked, her tone gentler but still leaning toward her. Margaret nodded furiously. "I'm positive. I've been on the neighborhood board for years. I'm the one who organizes block parties and holiday events. I know my neighbors. He's not one of them." Desmond stood there, feeling his pulse throb in his ears, the injustice of it all burning in his chest. It wasn't just about this moment anymore. It was about all the moments leading up to it, the countless times his mere presence had been questioned, the assumptions people made before he even spoke. And now here he was, his identity, his very right to walk down his own street being challenged because of one woman's misplaced confidence. The officers were clearly torn now. The male officer rubbed the back of his neck. A frown stretched across his face while his partner kept her eyes on Margaret, as though waiting for her final decision. "Look," Margaret said, lowering her voice slightly as though trying to sound reasonable now. "All I'm asking is that you do your job and make sure he really lives here. What harm could it do to double-check, right?" The male officer hesitated, then looked back at the man. "Sir," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I'm going to need you to give us some more information. Can you tell us the name of the person on the title for the house? Maybe verify a few things just to be sure?" A mix of anger and exhaustion went through him. He had already given them everything they needed, yet here they were still asking for more proof. Would there ever be a time when his word was enough? Or would it always be undermined by the loudness of someone like Margaret? "Look," Desmond said, his voice calm but steely, "I've already given you my address and ID. I don't know what more you need, but this is my neighborhood. I have just as much right to be here as anyone else." The male officer's face tightened, and he turned to Margaret, whose expression was now a strange mixture of triumph and righteousness. She folded her arms across her chest, satisfied that her word had carried so much weight. The female officer glanced nervously between them, sensing the tension but seemingly not wanting to diffuse it. The tension hung thick in the air as Desmond slowly walked away, his heart pounding beneath his calm exterior. He had always known that these moments, these unjust, racially charged encounters were inevitable. The bitterness clung to him, settling deep inside, a reminder of how fragile his place in this neighborhood still was. But just as his thoughts started to drift back to the warmth of his home, something unexpected happened. A sharp gasp echoed from behind him, followed by the unmistakable thud of a body hitting the ground. Margaret Evans, who had stood so sure of herself moments ago, was now collapsed on her pristine lawn, her hand clutching at her chest, her face twisted in pain and her eyes wide with terror. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze in place. The two officers stared in shock, momentarily stunned by the sudden shift in events. Margaret struggled to breathe, her body convulsing slightly as her breath came in short, sharp gasps. Her lips were beginning to pale, and a low, strangled sound escaped her throat. The confident, self-righteous woman was now reduced to a frail, vulnerable figure lying on the grass. The male officer, still nearest to her, reacted first. He dropped down beside her, shouting over his shoulder to call for an ambulance. The female officer scrambled for her radio, her voice shaky as she relayed the emergency. But there was a problem. Desmond could see it immediately. They had no idea what to do. The male officer was checking for a pulse, his movements awkward and frantic. He fumbled through chest compressions, but his technique was sloppy and unpracticed. Margaret's eyes rolled back, her body jerking with the uneven rhythm of the compressions, and it was clear she was fading fast. The officer's inexperience was painfully obvious. Margaret's life was slipping away, and they couldn't stop it. Desmond stopped walking, turning back toward the scene. His own pulse quickened, but this time it wasn't from anger or frustration. It was instinct. This was something deeper, something ingrained in him from years of training. He didn't need to think twice. He moved toward them quickly, but purposefully. "I'm a doctor," he said, his voice cutting through the panic, calm and steady. The male officer looked up, startled, as if unsure whether to trust him. The weight of what had just gone between them lingered in the air, complicating what should have been a straightforward moment, but there was no time to debate. Margaret was slipping away, and no amount of doubt or racial bias could change the fact that he was the only person who could help. "Step aside," he said firmly, taking control of the situation with the same quiet authority he used in the operating room. The male officer hesitated for a split second, but the urgency of the situation overcame any lingering doubt. He moved back, allowing Desmond to kneel beside Margaret. The doctor and he took over, calm, focused, and detached from the emotions that had clouded the earlier encounter. Margaret's pulse was weak, her skin pale and clammy. He immediately checked her vital signs, then began performing CPR with the precision and rhythm born from years of experience. His hands pressed against her chest, steady and sure, compressing with the perfect amount of force to circulate her blood. The officers watched in stunned silence as Desmond worked, his expertise clear in every movement. There was no hesitation in him, no second-guessing. He had done this 100 times before, and this time was no different. Life was at stake, and nothing else mattered. Margaret's breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling irregularly as he continued compressions. He knew there was a chance she could survive if the ambulance arrived in time, but it wasn't guaranteed. Her heart had faltered, and only quick intervention could pull her back from the brink. The female officer, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly, relayed the situation to the emergency dispatcher. "We have a civilian administering CPR," she said into the radio, her voice shaking. "Patient is in cardiac arrest. We need that ambulance here now." But the ambulance was still minutes away, and in these moments, minutes felt like an eternity. Desmond didn't flinch, didn't look up. His mind was focused entirely on the task at hand. He knew Margaret's life was in his hands, and despite everything she had done, her accusations, her assumptions, her dismissal of his existence, he didn't allow any of it to influence him. This was what he had trained for. It didn't matter who she was or what had just happened between them. Right now, she was just a patient in need. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, quickly finding the number for the nearest hospital. After relaying the situation, he put the phone down and continued compressions, his movements automatic and precise. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "Stay with me." After what felt like an eternity but was likely only a minute or two, there was a flicker of response. Margaret's chest rose with a deeper breath, her body jerking slightly as she began to regain consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, then closed again. But the signs were there. Her heart was beating again. He continued working, keeping her alive until the ambulance arrived. When the paramedics finally pulled up, rushing toward the scene, he gave them a quick, professional rundown of what had happened and what he had done. They nodded, listening intently, their respect for his expertise clear in their eyes. They loaded Margaret onto a stretcher, administering oxygen and stabilizing her for the ride to the hospital. The paramedics thanked him, recognizing that he had saved her life. Without his intervention, the outcome would have been much worse. As they wheeled Margaret toward the ambulance, Desmond stood up, his body finally registering the fatigue of the past few minutes. He wiped the sweat from his brow and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him. The officers were silent, their earlier suspicion and hostility replaced by a mixture of shock and something that might have been shame. The male officer, who had been the first to question him, took a step forward, awkwardly clearing his throat. "Thank you," he said, his voice loud, almost reluctant. "You saved her life." The man looked at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. He didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch out between them. Finally he spoke, his voice calm and measured. "I was just doing my job." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving the officer standing in stunned silence, the patrol car's lights still flashing in the dimming evening light. But the tension had shifted, replaced by something heavier, an unspoken recognition of what had just happened to them. The man walked down the quiet tree-lined street, his steps slow and steady, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. Desmond wasn't thinking about Margaret or the officers anymore. He had saved a life today. But the weight of what had happened, of what it had taken to get to this point, remained. This was his neighborhood, and despite what anyone thought, he belonged here. 24 hours had now passed since the situation on the street. Margaret was lying in the hospital bed, the sterile environment humming with the quiet sounds of machines monitoring her heartbeat. Her chest rose and fell weakly as her eyes remained closed, but her mind was anything but calm. She began to drift into an uneasy dream. Margaret walked alone down the sidewalk of her familiar upscale neighborhood. The houses were perfectly maintained, just as they always were, but something felt off. There was a stillness in the air, a weight that pressed down on her chest. She looked around and noticed figures standing along the sidewalks, watching her. Their faces were familiar. People of color she had passed by, strangers she had silently judged, neighbors she had looked at with suspicion. Their eyes followed her every move, but they remained silent. Margaret tried to avoid their gaze, picking up her pace, but the further she walked, the more people seemed to appear. The feeling of being judged, of being watched, overwhelmed her. She wanted to run, to disappear, but she couldn't. The figures stood firm, unmoving, their eyes boring into her, astounded. Suddenly, she found herself standing in front of her own house. She looked through the window, expecting to see her warm, familiar home. But instead of seeing Desmond, she saw herself inside. She was standing by the window, phone in hand, just as she had been earlier, watching, judging. Her own reflection stared back at her, cold and detached. Margaret felt a surge of panic rise in her chest. Her reflection showed no emotion, no recognition of the fear that now gripped her. She gasped for air, clutching at her chest. The figures outside began to close in on her, their eyes still locked on her, but their expressions never changed. Margaret stumbled backward, her heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The pressure built in her chest, suffocating her. She collapsed, the weight of it all crashing down on her as everything around her faded into darkness. Margaret's eyes snapped open. She was back in the hospital, panting heavily as she struggled to catch her breath. Her heart monitor beeped frantically, echoing the panic still ringing in her. The room was quiet, but the dream lingered, haunting her. Her daughter Sarah rushed to her side, concern etched on her face. "Mom, are you okay? You look like you were having a nightmare." Margaret closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. Her heart was still racing, the memory of the dream too vivid to shake. "It wasn't just a dream," she whispered, her voice weak and trembling. Sarah pulled up a chair next to her mother, confused but concerned. "What do you mean?" Margaret stared at the ceiling, her eyes glistening with tears. "I saw myself, Sarah. I saw myself for who I really am, what I've become." Her voice broke, the shame of it all weighing heavily on her chest. Sarah furrowed her brow. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Margaret's hands trembled as she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I judged him, Desmond. I didn't know anything about him, but I called the police just because I was scared. I thought he didn't belong here, and then he saved my life. And in my dream, all I could see was myself watching, judging. I never thought about how wrong it was until now." Sarah reached out gently, holding her mother's hand. "You've always been protective of us, but yeah, sometimes I noticed you were quick to judge people who don't look like us." Margaret's tears spilled over, her sobs quiet but uncontrollable. "I don't know how I became this way. I never wanted to be like this. I thought I was protecting us, protecting our neighborhood, but all I did was hurt people. People like Desmond who didn't deserve it." Sarah squeezed her mother's hand, trying to offer comfort. "Mom, maybe this is your chance to change, to make things right. You're still here. You're alive because of him. You can learn from this." Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with regret. "I need to find him, Sarah. I need to apologize." Sarah nodded back, understanding the weight of her mother's words. "We'll find him, Mom. We'll make it right." She closed her eyes, exhausted but determined. The guilt that once consumed her was still there, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. She had a second chance, one she didn't intend to waste. A few days later, Margaret was discharged from the hospital, stepping out of the car. She leaned on Sarah for support, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. Everything felt different now. The street, the house, even the sky overhead. It was the same neighborhood she had lived in for years, but today it felt like she was seeing it with new eyes. As she walked up the front steps, her legs still weak, Margaret hesitated at the door. She turned to Sarah, who gave her a soft nod of encouragement. The guilt that had weighed on her heart since that day was heavier now, and the thought of what she had to do next filled her with nervous anticipation. Inside the house, Margaret sat on the couch, staring out the large bay window where she had once stood watching Desmond walk by. The memory of that moment haunted her. How quickly she had judged him, how easily she had made assumptions about a man she didn't know. Her hands trembled slightly as they rested on her lap, and her eyes kept flicking back to the phone on the coffee table. Desmond's contact information was already pulled up, and the phone seemed to taunt her, reminding her of what she had to do. Sarah watched her mother from across the room, giving her the space she needed, but ready to offer support when the time came. Margaret's chest tightened, her breath shaky. Apologizing to Desmond felt like the most daunting thing she had ever faced. How do you ask for forgiveness from someone you wronged so deeply? She took a deep breath and finally picked up the phone, her fingers trembling as she pressed the call button. The phone rang, and with each passing second, Margaret's heart raced faster. On the other end, Desmond picked up. His voice was calm but cautious, not recognizing the number. Margaret's words caught in her throat, but she forced herself to speak. She introduced herself nervously, explaining that she's the woman from the neighborhood, the one he helped. There's a long pause on Desmond's side of the line. A silence that feels like an eternity. Margaret can almost hear the tension through the phone, imagining the thoughts racing through his mind. Finally, he responds, his tone neutral but not unkind, asking how she's doing. Margaret takes a deep breath. This is the moment. Her voice trembles as she begins to apologize. She tells Desmond how sorry she is for the way she judged him, for calling the police when he was doing nothing wrong. She admits that her fear and ignorance got the best of her, and that she made assumptions about him that were unfair and cruel. Tears welled up in her eyes as she speaks, the weight of her actions crashing down on her with each word. She explains how she's been thinking about it ever since, how she's been haunted by the fact that, despite her actions, he still saved her life. Desmond is silent on the other end, listening to her pour her heart out. Margaret continues, her voice cracking with emotion as she expresses how deeply ashamed she is. She doesn't expect forgiveness, she tells him, but she wants him to know how truly sorry she is. She's determined to change, to learn from this, and to never let her fear guide her actions again. Margaret's voice trembles as she admits she doesn't know how to make it right, but she's willing to try, no matter what it takes. The silence on the other end of the line stretches again, and Margaret holds her breath, waiting for Desmond's response. After what feels like an eternity, Desmond speaks. His voice is calm, but there's a softness to it that Margaret hadn't expected. He tells her that while what happened was hurtful, he's heard similar apologies before, but something in her voice makes him believe she's sincere. Margaret listens, her heart pounding as Desmond tells her that people make mistakes. What matters, he says, is what they do afterward. Here on Karma's Twists, we share the most impactful stories of karma and justice that the world needs to see. Don't miss a single moment of good triumphing over evil. Join our community and subscribe. Be part of the movement that believes justice always wins.